In the aftermath of every crisis, we witness the same predictable ritual. Experts emerge from universities and think tanks, armed with charts, models, and comprehensive plans to solve our political problems once and for all. Yet somehow, these rational solutions consistently produce outcomes that confound their architects. The housing programs that create homelessness, the education reforms that diminish learning, the healthcare systems that obstruct healing, all bear the fingerprints of expert design. Why does this pattern persist? Because we have forgotten a fundamental truth about political life. It is not a technical problem awaiting rational solution, but a practical art requiring wisdom cultivated through experience. Politics cannot be improved through the application of abstract theories any more than friendship can be enhanced by following a manual. Today, I want to explore why expert knowledge, for all its technical sophistication, remains fundamentally inadequate to the complexities of political life, and why traditional wisdom offers a more reliable guide through the uncertainties that define human affairs. Chapter 1: The Fatal Attraction of Technical Solutions. The modern mind finds irresistible the promise that politics can be conducted like engineering, that human societies can be designed, adjusted, and optimized according to rational principles. This is what I have called political rationalism, the belief that political problems are essentially technical problems, requiring only sufficient expertise and proper methodology to solve. Consider the seductive logic of this approach. If we can send rockets to the moon, surely we can eliminate poverty. If we can decode the human genome, surely we can design perfect educational systems. If we can create artificial intelligence, surely we can rationalize the messy business of governance. The rationalist sees no fundamental difference between building a bridge and building a just society. Both require blueprints, expertise, and systematic implementation. But this analogy reveals more than it intends. A bridge serves a single, clearly defined purpose: to carry traffic across an obstacle. Its success can be measured precisely. Politics, however, serves no single purpose. It emerges from the intersection of countless individual purposes, many of them contradictory, most of them only partially understood by those who hold them. The expert approaches politics with what appears to be admirable precision. Armed with statistics, theories, and models, he diagnoses social problems as if they were mechanical failures. Unemployment becomes a matter of insufficient aggregate demand. Crime reflects inadequate incentive structures. Educational underachievement indicates flawed pedagogical techniques. Each problem seems to call for a corresponding technical solution. Yet something essential gets lost in this translation from lived experience to abstract analysis. The expert sees poverty as a statistical phenomenon to be eliminated through redistribution algorithms. The person experiencing poverty inhabits a complex web of relationships, aspirations, disappointments, and possibilities that resist reduction to economic variables. The gap between expert knowledge and human reality explains why rational policies so often generate consequences their designers never anticipated. This technical mentality transforms politics from a conversation among citizens into a consultation with specialists. Instead of asking, "What kind of community do we want to be?" we ask, "What does the data tell us?" Instead of deliberating about competing goods and inevitable trade-offs, we search for optimal solutions. The rich messiness of political life gets flattened into problems and solutions, inputs and outputs, means and ends. The rationalist assumes that once we understand the mechanics of social problems, we can engineer appropriate responses. But political problems are not mechanical failures. They arise from the inherent tensions of human life in community, between freedom and order, equality and excellence, innovation and tradition, individual desires and collective needs. These tensions cannot be resolved through technical expertise because they reflect permanent features of the human condition. This is not an argument against knowledge or learning. Rather, it is a recognition that political wisdom requires a different kind of knowledge than technical expertise provides, a knowledge rooted in experience rather than theory, in understanding rather than explanation, in practical judgment rather than abstract analysis. Chapter 2: The Wisdom Embedded in Traditional Practices. What the expert dismisses as inefficient tradition often contains wisdom that has been tested across generations of human experience. Traditional practices emerged not from someone's rational design, but from countless adjustments, modifications, and refinements made by people actually living with the consequences of their arrangements. Consider the institution of marriage. No expert designed this complex arrangement of emotional, legal, economic, and spiritual commitments. It evolved through centuries of human experience with the challenges of raising children, caring for the elderly, organizing economic cooperation, and navigating the tensions between individual desires and social responsibilities. The result is an institution that serves multiple purposes no single designer could have anticipated or planned. Now observe what happens when experts attempt to rationalize marriage. They identify specific problems: gender inequality, economic inefficiency, psychological stress. They propose solutions: modified contracts, altered legal frameworks, therapeutic interventions. Each reform aims to correct particular deficiencies identified through rational analysis. Yet the more marriage gets subjected to expert redesign, the more it loses its capacity to perform the functions it traditionally served. This is not because the experts are malicious or incompetent, but because they cannot replicate through conscious design the accumulated wisdom embedded in evolved practices. Traditional practices embody what I call tacit knowledge, understanding that exists in our actions and habits rather than in our explicit theories. A master craftsman knows more about his craft than he can explain to an apprentice. Similarly, a traditional practice knows more about human nature and social coordination than any expert analysis can capture. This tacit dimension of tradition explains why seemingly irrational customs often prove remarkably resilient and functional. The elaborate courtesies that govern social interaction may appear inefficient to rationalist analysis, but they serve crucial functions in managing the tensions and conflicts that arise when different personalities must cooperate. Religious rituals may seem primitive to scientific minds, but they bind communities together and provide meaning in ways that no rational substitute has successfully replicated. Consider the traditional practices surrounding property ownership. No economic theorist designed the complex web of customs, laws, and expectations that govern how we use, transfer, and inherit material goods. These arrangements evolved through countless generations of human experience with the problems of scarcity, coordination, and intergenerational responsibility. They embody solutions to problems that economists are only beginning to understand formally. When experts attempt to rationalize property arrangements, through land reform, tax policy, or regulatory frameworks, they often destroy subtle mechanisms that had evolved to balance competing claims and interests. The unintended consequences reveal the inadequacy of expert knowledge compared to the accumulated wisdom of traditional practice. This is why successful political reforms usually work with the grain of existing practices rather than against it. They recognize that current arrangements, however imperfect, represent solutions to real problems that may not be immediately apparent to rational analysis. The reformer's task is not to replace these arrangements with better designs, but to understand what purposes they serve and how they might be improved without destroying their essential character. The American constitutional system exemplifies this approach. Rather than designing government from abstract principles, the founders built upon English constitutional traditions, colonial experience, and practical knowledge of how different arrangements actually worked. They reformed tradition rather than replacing it with rational blueprints. Their genius lay not in theoretical innovation but in practical wisdom about how to adapt inherited practices to new circumstances. Chapter 3: why political problems resist technical solutions. Take a moment to consider why your personal relationships cannot be improved through expert advice alone. You know that friendship requires judgment, sensitivity, and responsiveness to particular circumstances that no manual can anticipate. Politics involves the same kind of complexity, multiplied across millions of people with different backgrounds, values, and aspirations. Political problems are not like engineering problems because they involve human beings whose behavior changes in response to the solutions attempted. When experts design welfare systems to eliminate poverty, people adjust their behavior in ways that may undermine the system's effectiveness. When they create regulations to prevent corporate malfeasance, corporations find new ways to pursue their interests within the regulatory framework. The very act of implementing expert solutions changes the conditions the solutions were designed to address. This dynamic quality of political life means that rational planning must constantly play catch-up with evolving reality. The 5-year plan becomes obsolete before implementation. The comprehensive education reform fails to account for how teachers, students, and parents actually respond to new incentives. The healthcare redesign generates unexpected consequences that require further expert intervention. Moreover, political problems often exist precisely because different groups have conflicting values and interests that cannot be resolved through technical means. Should community development prioritize economic growth or environmental protection? Should education emphasize equality or excellence? Should immigration policy favor humanitarian concerns or economic impact? These are not questions experts can answer through analysis, because they require choices between legitimate but incompatible goods. The expert typically responds to such dilemmas by seeking higher-order principles that can resolve conflicts rationally. But this approach misconceives the nature of political life. Politics exists precisely because human communities must find ways to live together despite fundamental disagreements about values and priorities. The politician's art consists in navigating these disagreements without pretending they can be eliminated through rational analysis. Consider how expertly designed urban planning repeatedly fails to create the vibrant communities its architects envision. The planners understand traffic flows, population densities, and economic efficiencies. But they cannot design the informal networks of relationship and trust that make neighborhoods into communities. They can provide infrastructure, but they cannot manufacture the social capital that transforms infrastructure into livable places. The failure is not technical but philosophical. The planners assume that human communities are like machines that can be optimized through proper design. But communities are more like organisms that grow through processes no designer can fully control or predict. They develop their character through countless small interactions and adaptations that occur over time in response to local conditions and particular circumstances. This organic quality of political life explains why attempts to transplant successful policies from one context to another so often disappoint. What works in Sweden may fail in California, not because the policies are poorly implemented, but because the social and cultural conditions that made them work in Sweden do not exist in California. Expert knowledge can identify the formal features of successful policies, but it cannot replicate the informal conditions that make them successful. This is why political judgment differs fundamentally from technical expertise. Technical knowledge tells us how to achieve specified goals efficiently. Political wisdom helps us discern which goals are worth pursuing, how different goods can be balanced, what trade-offs are acceptable to a particular community at a particular time, and how reforms can be implemented without destroying the social fabric that makes community life possible. Chapter 4: The Education of Political Judgment versus Technical Training. Our universities increasingly train students to become experts rather than citizens. We teach them to analyze problems, design solutions, and implement reforms. But we fail to cultivate the political judgment that enables them to understand what problems are worth solving, what solutions are likely to work, and what reforms serve human flourishing rather than abstract ideals. Political judgment cannot be acquired through studying methodology or mastering analytical techniques. It develops through participation in the activities it seeks to understand. Just as you cannot learn to ride a bicycle by reading physics texts, you cannot learn politics by studying political science. Political understanding emerges from engagement with actual political problems, not from theoretical models of how politics ought to work. This is why the most effective political leaders often lack formal training in political theory. They possess instead what we might call political intelligence, an intuitive grasp of how communities actually function, what motivates different groups, and how changes in one area affect other areas in unpredictable ways. This intelligence develops through experience with the messiness and complexity of real political life. Liberal education once aimed to cultivate such judgment by exposing students to the great political texts, not as scientific treatises, but as invitations to participate in humanity's ongoing conversation about how to live together. Students read Aristotle not to learn facts about ancient politics, but to develop their capacity for political reflection. They studied Burke not to memorize conservative principles, but to understand how tradition and change could be balanced in their own time. This approach recognized that political wisdom emerges through what I call conversation, an ongoing exchange of ideas and experiences in which participants learn from each other while maintaining their distinct perspectives. The great political works of the past are voices in this conversation, offering insights and arguments that remain relevant because they address perennial human problems rather than temporary technical challenges. Contemporary higher education has largely abandoned this approach in favor of specialized training. Students learn to conduct surveys, analyze data, and construct models. They master techniques for measuring public opinion, calculating policy outcomes, and optimizing institutional arrangements. All valuable skills, but none that cultivate the political wisdom their society desperately needs. The result is a class of credentialed experts who know much about the mechanics of politics but little about its spirit. They can tell you how to win elections but not why particular candidates deserve support. They can design efficient bureaucracies but cannot explain why bureaucratic efficiency might sometimes conflict with democratic values. They mistake technical competence for political wisdom. This confusion between training and education reflects a broader misunderstanding about the nature of knowledge itself. Technical training provides information and skills that can be applied mechanically to solve specified problems. Education cultivates judgment and understanding that enables people to navigate uncertain situations requiring wisdom rather than technique. The difference appears clearly in how we prepare people for different activities. We train engineers to apply scientific principles to practical problems. We educate doctors to exercise medical judgment in complex situations where scientific knowledge provides guidance but cannot determine particular decisions. Politics requires the latter kind of preparation, but we increasingly provide only the former. The cultivation of political judgment requires what I call the voice of liberal learning, an approach to education that emphasizes understanding rather than information, wisdom rather than technique, conversation rather than indoctrination. Such education does not produce experts with predetermined answers, but thoughtful citizens capable of asking appropriate questions and weighing competing considerations in particular circumstances. Chapter 5: The American Tradition of Political Prudence. Reflect for a moment on how American political traditions embody precisely the kind of practical wisdom that expert culture tends to dismiss. The constitutional system was not designed by political scientists but by practicing politicians who understood the limitations of rational planning in human affairs. The founders did not begin with abstract theories about ideal government. They started with practical problems. How can different states cooperate while maintaining their distinct characters? How can government be given enough power to function effectively without becoming tyrannical? How can temporary majorities be prevented from oppressing permanent minorities? Their solutions emerged from careful attention to how different arrangements had actually worked in practice. Consider the genius of federalism, not as a theoretical construct, but as a practical arrangement that allows different communities to pursue different approaches to common problems. Rather than imposing uniform rational solutions, federalism enables experimentation, comparison, and gradual learning from experience. It recognizes that what works in Massachusetts might not work in Texas, not because one approach is objectively superior, but because different communities have different characters, traditions, and circumstances. The American tradition of local self-government reflects similar wisdom. Rather than trusting remote experts to design optimal policies, it relies on local knowledge and local responsibility. People closest to problems often understand them better than distant analysts, and they certainly live more directly with the consequences of attempted solutions. This tradition assumes that political wisdom emerges from the bottom up through experience, not from the top down through expertise. Even our economic system, despite its obvious imperfections, embodies this preference for evolved solutions over designed ones. Market arrangements allow millions of people to coordinate their activities without central planning. Prices convey information about relative scarcity and demand more efficiently than any expert analysis could. Innovation emerges from decentralized experimentation rather than centralized research and development. This does not mean American traditions are perfect or unchangeable. Rather, it means they contain accumulated wisdom about how complex societies can function without detailed rational control. Reform works best when it builds upon this wisdom rather than trying to replace it with expert designs. The separation of powers illustrates this point beautifully. No rational planner would design a system where different branches of government can obstruct each other's initiatives. From an efficiency standpoint, unified authority would seem superior. But the founders understood that political efficiency is not the highest good. They preferred a system that prevents the concentration of power, even at the cost of governmental effectiveness. The wisdom of this arrangement becomes apparent when we observe how unified governmental authority, however well-intentioned, tends toward bureaucratic overreach and policy disasters. The friction built into the American system forces deliberation, compromise, and gradual change rather than rapid implementation of expert designs. This friction often frustrates reformers, but it also prevents many mistakes that unified systems cannot avoid. American federalism also embodies a sophisticated understanding of how political knowledge develops and spreads. Rather than assuming that wisdom resides in national capitals, it enables different states and localities to try different approaches to common problems. Successful innovations can be adopted by other jurisdictions, while failures remain localized rather than affecting the entire nation. This approach treats political communities as laboratories of democracy, but laboratories in the true sense, places where hypotheses are tested against reality rather than places where predetermined conclusions are confirmed through controlled experiments. The knowledge that emerges from such testing is practical rather than theoretical, contextual rather than universal, provisional rather than final. Chapter 6: The Unintended Consequences of Well-Intended Reforms. Every major policy disaster of the past century began with experts confidently predicting beneficial outcomes from rational interventions. Urban renewal would eliminate slums and create vibrant communities. Educational centralization would improve learning and promote equality. Healthcare reform would increase access while controlling costs. Welfare expansion would eliminate poverty while strengthening families. The pattern is always the same: experts identify problems, design comprehensive solutions, implement reforms with great fanfare, then express surprise when results diverge dramatically from predictions. The solutions create new problems that require additional expert intervention, which generates further unintended consequences, leading to ever more complex systems that become increasingly difficult to reform or abandon. Consider urban renewal, perhaps the most dramatic example of expert planning applied to human communities. Housing experts diagnosed slums as products of inadequate design and insufficient investment. Their solution: demolish existing neighborhoods and replace them with rationally planned developments that would house more people in better conditions at lower cost. The planners saw only buildings where residents experienced communities. They calculated square footage where families had built networks of mutual support. They designed efficient traffic patterns where children had learned to navigate social relationships. The result was not improved housing but destroyed communities whose reconstruction proved impossible despite massive subsequent investment. The planners' mistake was not technical but philosophical. They assumed that communities could be designed like machines, with each component serving a specified function in pursuit of predetermined goals. But communities are not machines. They are complex networks of relationship and meaning that develop organically through countless interactions over time. These networks cannot be replicated through conscious design because their essential features are invisible to rational analysis. Or examine the expansion of administrative bureaucracy, justified by the need for rational coordination of complex modern societies. Each new agency was created to solve specific problems identified by expert analysis. Yet the proliferation of agencies created coordination problems that required additional agencies to address. The system designed to increase government effectiveness has often achieved the opposite. The fundamental error lies in assuming that complex systems can be improved through comprehensive rational redesign. Such systems resist improvement precisely because their behavior emerges from interactions among countless elements that experts cannot fully comprehend or control. Attempts to optimize these systems often destroy the very features that made them function effectively, even if those features were not apparent to rational analysis. Consider educational reform, where decades of expert intervention have consistently failed to improve learning while successfully undermining the authority relationships that make education possible. Each reform identifies real problems and proposes rational solutions. Yet the cumulative effect has been to transform schools from communities of learning into bureaucratic institutions focused on measuring rather than achieving educational outcomes. The reformers see inefficiencies where traditional educators see necessary relationships. They design accountability systems where teachers need professional autonomy. They create uniform standards where learning requires attention to individual differences. Each rational innovation makes schools more systematic and less educational. This pattern reveals something fundamental about the relationship between expert knowledge and political reality. Complex systems resist rational redesign because their behavior emerges from interactions among countless elements that experts cannot fully comprehend or control. Attempts to improve such systems through comprehensive planning often destroy the very features that made them function effectively. This is not an argument for never attempting reforms. Rather, it suggests that successful reform requires the kind of prudence that prefers gradual adjustment to revolutionary reconstruction, experimentation to systematic implementation, and reversible changes to irreversible transformations. Chapter 7: Recovering Political Wisdom in an Age of Expertise. How then should we approach the genuine problems that confront contemporary American society? Not by abandoning knowledge or expertise, but by recognizing their proper place within the larger art of political judgment. Experts can provide valuable information about particular aspects of complex problems. But political wisdom involves understanding how different aspects relate to each other and to the broader fabric of social life. The cultivation of such wisdom begins with intellectual humility, recognition that political problems typically involve trade-offs among legitimate but competing goods rather than technical challenges awaiting optimal solutions. This means accepting that every political choice involves gains and losses that cannot be eliminated through better analysis or more sophisticated implementation. It requires attention to how particular reforms affect the character of institutions and communities, not just their measurable outputs. A school system that improves test scores while undermining the authority of teachers and parents may have achieved a technical success while suffering a political failure. A healthcare system that expands access while destroying the doctor-patient relationship may solve one problem while creating others that resist technical remediation. Political wisdom also demands respect for the accumulated experience embedded in existing arrangements, even when those arrangements seem inefficient or outdated. Before attempting reforms, we should try to understand what purposes current practices serve and what unintended consequences their replacement might generate. This does not mean opposing all change, but rather approaching change with the caution appropriate to alterations in complex systems whose full behavior we cannot predict. Perhaps most importantly, recovering political wisdom requires reviving the American tradition of citizen responsibility rather than expert dependence. Citizens who understand their communities, participate in local institutions, and take responsibility for common problems are more likely to make wise political choices than those who delegate such decisions to distant experts. This does not mean every citizen must become a policy expert. Rather, it means citizens should cultivate the judgment necessary to evaluate expert claims and maintain ultimate authority over the direction of their communities. In a democracy, political wisdom must be distributed among the citizenry, not concentrated among credentialed elites. The recovery of citizen wisdom requires institutions that promote genuine political participation rather than mere electoral choice. Town meetings, local boards, voluntary associations, and religious congregations provide opportunities for citizens to practice the arts of persuasion, compromise, and collective decision-making. These institutions cultivate practical knowledge about how communities actually function and what reforms are likely to succeed. Such participation teaches lessons that no amount of expert analysis can provide. Citizens learn that political problems rarely have neat solutions, that every choice involves trade-offs, that unintended consequences are the rule rather than the exception, and that the art of politics consists in navigating uncertainty rather than implementing certainty. This education in political reality provides the foundation for wise evaluation of expert claims. Citizens who have wrestled with the complexities of local problems are less likely to be seduced by comprehensive national solutions. They understand that what works in one context may fail in another, that implementation is usually more difficult than design, and that the best reforms build upon existing practices rather than replacing them. The cultivation of such citizen wisdom requires what we might call a conservative disposition, not adherence to particular policies or ideologies, but a temperamental preference for gradual change, local knowledge, and inherited practices. This disposition does not oppose all innovation, but it insists that innovation prove itself through experience rather than theory, that reforms respect the complexity of existing arrangements, and that change proceed with attention to unintended consequences. Conclusion. The failure of expert governance is not a technical problem requiring better expertise, but a philosophical problem requiring different assumptions about the nature of political life. Politics is not applied science but practical art, requiring the kind of wisdom that emerges from experience rather than analysis, participation rather than observation, judgment rather than calculation. This recognition does not make us anti-intellectual or anti-expert. Rather, it makes us discriminating about what kinds of knowledge serve what kinds of purposes. We can value expert analysis while recognizing its limitations. We can appreciate technical knowledge while understanding its proper place within the broader conversation that constitutes political life. The path forward lies not in better expertise but in recovered citizenship, in men and women who understand their communities, participate in common enterprises, and take responsibility for the consequences of collective choices. Such citizens will know how to use expert knowledge without being enslaved by expert pretensions. They will prefer the tested wisdom of experience to the appealing certainty of rational plans. Most importantly, they will embrace the uncertainty and complexity that define political life as permanent features of the human condition rather than temporary problems awaiting expert solution.